Okay, let's get right down to it. So, um, hopefully it's been kind of a break that for chapter 10 and now for chapter 11, there's really no actual homework assignment. You will have this week to go over the shortened version here of chapter 11. It's much shorter than 9 and 10. I even cut a little bit of it. And next week, we will have our third exam on chapters 9, 10, and 11. And then your final will be 12 and 14, so just 2 chapters. There are 32 slides in this presentation, so I will probably split it up into half and half or so, or 2/3 and 1/3, something like that. But let's get through it, and yeah, here we go. So in the last 2 chapters, they were very similar and a little complicated in this sensation and perception module. We talked about the visual system and the auditory system in reverse order. And so today we are going to talk about the third system, which is the touch system. And you will see a few similarities as far as information crossing over to the other side of the brain, other hemisphere of the brain from the body and things like that. Like I said, we're going to skip things like some of the muscle stuff and things that I feel we already have enough detail. So I'm just going to try and stick to the bigger picture for this one. The sense of touch gives us information from our body about things that we are touching or things that are touching us so that we know what's happening in the real world. This is called our somatosenses. Remember, it goes to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. So this tells us information from our skin senses, meaning is something touching us? Are we touching something? Are we hot or cold? Is there pain? So conditions at the surface of the body. It tells us where we are, it helps us to know where we are in space. So it helps us to understand our body position and movement. So we call this proprioception. Remember that the parietal lobe, where the information about touch comes in, is also knowing where we are in space, how far or close we are to certain objects or what's in our environment. Pain, a lot of times, is on the surface along with the skin or bone or things like that, but it's also our interoceptive system, which means we can tell if something's wrong with our internal organs. So the sensations of our internal organs. So if you have a pain in your chest, or if you have a stomach ache, or if your kidney is hurting you, right? Some sort of internal organ, we still get that pain signal. So that's what we call the interoceptive system. And of course, the vestibular system, head position movement. One of the other canals in the cochlea from chapter 9 we talked about. There's 3 canals. The vestibular canal is actually the one that's there for balance. So if you see somebody with vertigo or they're really dizzy and they say that they have an inner ear problem, that's why, right? Because of that vestibular canal, which connects to the somatosenses, and that helps you to stay upright. So when we look at the sensations, again, touch, temperature, and pain. So touch, warmth and cold, and pain. Itch, we would consider, it wasn't originally considered part of the senses, but obviously if we're having an itch and we need to scratch it, whether that's advised or not, bug bite or whatever, still you feel it on your skin and you go for the scratching. So itch would technically also be part of this sensation type. So we have 2 different types of receptors in our skin. A couple of them towards the top surface of the skin, and a couple of them are a little bit deeper. And so we are going to talk about these. So the ones that detect temperature and pain are called free nerve endings, and they are basically kind of look like hair cells. Here's hairs, as you can see in the picture, sticking out of the skin. My arms are definitely covered with hair. And then below that, we have some encapsulated receptors. Just means that they have like a cap on them. So the free nerve endings look just like little nerves, kind of like little dendrites in the skin surface, detecting temperature and pain. And the actual touch itself are the encapsulated receptors. So that's things such as touching something, what's touching you, pressure, if you feel somebody pushing harder or you're pushing harder on something, stretching the fingers out, and even being able to detect between the different textures. Something feels smooth, something feels rough, something is jagged, like the serrated edge of a knife. I wouldn't put your fingers across that, but just being able to tell that without having to see it or anything like that, just being able to feel it and know, oh, that's sharp. Oh, that shouldn't be touched, right? Those are the encapsulated receptors. So we have two of those receptors on the top or superficial side of the skin, very close to the surface, as you can see from the picture on the right, which kind of dissects it. You can see that there are a few different layers of skin. And right at the top are the superficial receptors, which we call Meissner's corpuscles and Merkel discs. The Merkel discs specifically are the ones at the very top layer of skin. As you can see right here on the right, just a little bit closer than the hairs sticking out, you can see those little Merkel discs. And a little bit deeper, but still on the superficial side of things, are what we call Meissner's corpuscles. So the way that I try to remember this and use sort of this mnemonic detail or way to remember is that the two superficial ones are the M's. So Merkel and Meissner are the ones at the top of the skin. In between Merkel and Meissner, sort of that second layer of skin, is our free nerve endings. And the free nerve endings, again, are the ones that detect pain and temperature. So they're kind of in between. And then in the deeper layers, way down towards the bottom, we have the Pacinian corpuscle, which kind of looks like layers of an onion. And we have Ruffini endings. So Merkel and Meissner corpuscles and Ruffini endings is more about stretching, perception of being able to hold your hand out and grab a pen out of my hand, and being able to tell that you've actually grasped the object or if it's fallen through your fingers. So stretching, grasping, grabbing, holding, right? Those types of things are the deeper receptors, Ruffini and Pacinian, and just being able to tell what it is by touching it, knowing if it's barely a tap or harder, things like that would be the superficial Meissner and Merkel. So as I said, the free nerve endings detect hot, cold, and pain. Obviously, if you touch a hot stove, the problem is it's going to be really hot and it's going to be painful. So you'll get a combination of both with the free nerve endings. Too hot, ouch, that hurts. Too cold, ouch, that hurts, right? And so what the temperature sensing nerve endings are called, or TR, what they do is they open the transient receptor potentials. So it's a family of protein ion channels. And we have different types of pain, just like temperature is hot or cold. But you may notice something that I call sort of a circular notion, that if somebody's hand is too cold and it's getting frostbitten, it may feel like it's hot. And if somebody touches something that's too hot, it might circle around to feel cold. And it's sort of just running the spectrum there. No need to worry about anything specific. For temperature, you can remember the TRP, but we're not going to get anything specific, more specific than that on an exam. So there are several different types of receptors for pain. We have mechanical receptors, which are really unknown as far as the channels that they open. Chemical pain, which could be from things like smoke, from things like tear gas and foods, actually, if you eat too much or if they get too close to your eyes, like garlic and wasabi. Now, me, I love garlic. Don't like wasabi. I don't like the horseradishy one that makes my nose hurt. But that would be the TRPA1 receptor for chemical. Thermal, meaning too hot or too cold that causes pain, is the TRPV1, which is different from like hot temperature. So TRPV1 would be heat from eating something spicy like capsaicin. So in chili peppers, there is or in hot foods like that, spicy Mexican foods, um, salsas, hot wings, right? Things like that is capsaicin. And that activates the TRPV1 pain receptor and it tells you, oh my gosh, that's hot. I remember the other day I was watching a show on, I think it's the Travel Channel now, called Man versus Food. And there was a dude on there trying to take a challenge of eating 8 extremely hot wings, like habanero and ghost pepper wings, in 6 minutes. And he made it through 7 of them, but couldn't finish the 8th. And he was just physically, you could tell he was in a lot of pain from the heat. So you guys also may have seen a muscle rub, kind of like Icy Hot or Bengay, called capsaicin, which contains actual capsaicin. And why would this be used for joint pain? Well, remember that capsaicin activates this receptor. So if you overstimulate it and put capsaicin in the rub, what it does is it fatigues the receptors so they get tired out and they stop responding, and you get the relief from the pain. So that's how that works. That's the heat one. There's also a coolness receptor, which is activated by menthol, right? So the icy part of the icy hot, in this case, right, would be capsaicin on one end and menthol on the other end, which is a coolness receptor called the TRPM8. Again, you are not going to be responsible for having to know these specific V1, M8 type of things. Just remember the TRP family for pain and temperature. Moving on, we talked about, or we are talking about the other portion of the touch system, which is requiring you to know, information about your head position, your movement, in order for you to balance your body. So there, remember, we have 3 semicircular canals in the inner ear and the cochlea, and that they are sort of, well, all related to head movement. One is understanding where you are in space, keeping your balance. Of course, the other one is head movement towards hearing something, which would be that middle canal. There are 2 parts of the inner ear called the utricle and saccule, which are projecting or allowing for your head position relative to gravity, so you know when you are and when you're not falling over. And that information about balance projects to the cerebellum and brainstem. Remember that the medulla and the pons are helping to coordinate movements as well as coordinate breathing and heart rate. The cerebellum is also stabilizing you. So you can understand the cerebellum's involvement, the brainstem involvement, and then there is a cortex in the parietal insular vestibular cortex. So parietal means parietal lobe, which connects to the insula, which is where taste and smell are on the underside of the prefrontal cortex, as well as an area called the vestibular cortex. Again, we're not going to worry about this. This is something I just wanted to bring up to you. But if this pathway from the inner ear to the cerebellum, brainstem, and this parieto-insular vestibular cortex is messed up, that can give somebody a really rough go at things because they will always be dizzy, even standing still. So if that pathway is interrupted, the person would have a lot of problems trying to remain still and keep gravity doing what it's supposed to be doing. They would always be dizzy. They may have vertigo, a lot, maybe chronic vertigo, and it would not be a pleasant thing. So going back to the touch system, away from balance, I know I wanted to touch upon it. See what I did there? I know, really bad, especially on a Monday. If you're watching this on a Monday, that is. So when we talk about the pons, as it's sending axons from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord is sectioned off. And as we talked about in the motor cortex up in the frontal lobe, that there is a specific spot that if it is innervated by nerves, right? Innervated by, I guess you'd say, tracts in this case, because it's in the central nervous system. So dermatomes correspond to each sort of section that a nerve is connected to. And this helps us to understand the flow of sensory information. So if we are going to send an information, a command to our body for one of our muscles to move, let's say I'm playing dodgeball and I need to duck because a dodgeball is coming straight at my face. Well, my brain would have to send information down through an axon from the motor cortex, which goes down through the pons, via the thalamus. Remember that information, 4 of the 5 senses go up through the thalamus, and sensory and motor information also go back down through the thalamus to make sure that that signal is nice and strong. So if we have information about touch, maybe we got hit before in the face, then information from that hit to our face enters the spinal cord, goes up through the thalamus, and tells our somatosensory cortex, which of course is at the front of the parietal lobe, just on the other side of the motor cortex. Just like the other systems, as we've talked about in all 5 senses, the information crosses over. So if it hits me on the left cheek, left side of my face, it's going to cross over and it's going to be interpreted in the right somatosensory cortex. So information crosses over from one side of the body to the opposite brain area. It works the same way going back down. It is my motor cortex that says, hey, you got hit in the head last time, ball's coming at you, you better move. So my brain has to tell my body how to move. So the information goes back in reverse. From the motor cortex, that information is sent down through the thalamus, through the pons, and goes to the spinal cord. And each section of the spinal cord, called a dermatome, is going to correspond to a strip or area of the body. If I need, look at L2 and L3, which is my thighs or at least this picture of thighs and knees, and I need to bend down and duck, I'm going to send information at least to L2 and L3. That's lumbar 2 and lumbar 3. As you can see, the quads and thighs, and L3 is the knees to be able to bend, and I can hopefully duck out of the way. So each area of information, right, each sort of area or dermatome allows us to control a different section of muscles that are innervated by these axons, these nerves. And of course, if we're putting all the information together, when they are moving the muscles, they are sending acetylcholine to the muscles to move them. So when information about something hitting us goes up to the brain through the spinal cord, crosses over at the level of the spinal cord, goes up through the thalamus. So if I get hit on the left side of the face or the left side of the body, it's going to cross over in the spinal cord depending on where I was hit. It's going to go up through the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, and then it's going to tell me that that hurt and where it hurt. When I need to send information to go back, it goes back the opposite direction. Instead of going up to the somatosensory cortex, it goes up through goes down through the motor cortex right next door. Remember that the somatosensory and motor cortices are like twins. One brings the information up, and then the other one sends information back down. To make this as fast and efficient as possible, like let's say somebody grabs your forearm and then you pull it away really quick because you don't want people grabbing you. That's happening in milliseconds because the information is going from one area to its adjacent area, and because they're basically twins, the information is going back down real quick. So you can break and move your hand away when someone tries to grab you in, in milliseconds, basically, or at least by the time our body reacts in less than a second. So information going back down from the motor cortex through the thalamus to get coordinated. Those axons are part of the pons. From there, it goes down to the spinal cord, and depending on which dermatome, which area, in this case L2 and L3, lumbar 2, lumbar 3, I can move my thighs and quads, I can move my knees, and that allows me to duck and get out of the way of the next time a ball comes at my face. So, much like we saw in chapter 9 and chapter 10, here in chapter 11, the processing of these sensory pathways is hierarchical. It ends up at what we call, when I say the somatosensory cortex, what I mean is the primary somatosensory cortex. And then it goes on to secondary motor areas or secondary somatosensory cortex, and eventually coordinated to the prefrontal cortex. So in the auditory system, we talked about the body making a tonotopic map. In the chapter on vision, we talked about a visuotopic, what did I call it? Retinotopic map, from the retina to the visual cortex, retinotopic map. Well, guess what? In the touch system, it's not much difference. We have a somatotopic map. Remember that the primary somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex make up the areas of the body. It's called, it basically, when it was mapped out, they said it made up a little man. And as you can tell from the picture on the bottom right, that sort of the bottom part of the cortex, motor cortex and somatosensory cortex here, somatosensory cortex is what's pictured. You can see the face along the bottom takes up the most space in this area. You can see that the fingers and hands and thumb take up about the second most amount of space, and everything else is kind of secondary as you move from the bottom to the top of this cortex of the gyrus. So this cortical area is very proportional to your body part sensitivity. What that means is the more of the brain that is dedicated to it, the more nerves innervate it. Why then is the face the biggest, take up the most portion of the somatosensory and therefore the motor cortex? Because we have the most little muscles and nerves going to our face. Our face tells our emotional expressions. Our face gives away things. Our face is used for communication and language, right? So we have a lot of tiny little muscles and nerves that go to the face so that we can speak language and be very specific in our enunciation. B and P and T and V are all similar sounding, but you have to move your mouth in a very specific way for each of those to come out. And for us to be able to communicate and enunciate, right, we need a lot of, especially in the mouth, we need a lot of muscles that allow us to make these very precise movements. So we also see that the trunk at the top of the page is the most proportion of our body, right? It goes from basically the shoulders and chest all the way down to almost the knees. That's our trunk. And even though that's the biggest proportion of our body, that's one of the smallest areas of the brain dedicated to it. Why is that? We don't have a lot of nerves. Yes, we can move our torso and we can move our trunk in specific ways, up, front, back, left, right. We can kind of make a round circular hula hoop motion with it in one direction or the other, but there's not a lot of very precise movements like we see in the fingers. With a lot of dexterity, you can do a lot of different things, and of course with the face. So because there's not a lot of nerves in that area, it doesn't need a lot of information going to it because we can't make very specific movements with it. So although our trunk is the biggest proportion of our body, it's actually one of the smallest areas of the brain because there's not a lot. In fact, in Psych 1, I do this sensation and perception topic chapter, and I talk about the 2-point touch system in your back because there's a lack of nerves, even though your spinal cord goes down your back. I can put 2 fingers in your back and they'll be a couple inches apart before you realize there's actually 2 different points of touch because it's not a very sensitive area. There's not a lot of nerves there. And so it can still feel, even if my fingers are about 1.5 inches apart on your back, it still feels like 1 point of touch. If you don't believe me, have someone show you. Or if you had me for Psych 1, then you know because I demonstrated in class. So information flow, once it goes to the primary somatosensory cortex, this operational processing, it then goes from the primary to behind it in green. I'm sorry, it's to the, yeah, in dark green down below, the secondary somatosensory cortex where we get specific information. So information that is elementary about touch, something touching us or us touching something. If it is electric and it's causing a shock, if it's sharp and it's causing a pain, if it's dull and you just feel it, that information is going to be processed in the secondary somatosensory cortex. And then that information goes to the posterior parietal cortex. And guess what that does? Remember, the posterior parietal lobe is that area of neglect and part of the dorsal stream for the for the visual and auditory systems. So that information can be integrated together with vision and audition and touch, right? So that information is sort of wrapped together and then brought over to the prefrontal cortex to put it all together from all 5 senses. So looking at the primary somatosensory cortex, again, very similar to the visual system, what we see is excitatory center, inhibitory surround, kind of like what we saw in the receptive field of the ganglion cells. If you allow me to go back 1 chapter, remember that gives us the sort of opponent process theory. So where it's being touched is excited, where it's not being touched is inhibited, so that really makes it stand out that I'm being touched. This would be a monkey's forearm. So on the top of the forearm, I can feel the touch, and that inhibits the bottom of the forearm, so I know exactly where that point is. And where it's touched is going to give you the most action potentials, right? Again, the harder that it is or the longer that it's there, the more action potentials fire to let you know that something's touching you. But, so this allows us to understand features. Orientation, we may be able to tell which way the thing is touching us, especially if it's like a pencil. You're going to know if the point is hitting you versus the eraser versus the side of the pencil. It allows to tell you the direction of the movement across your hand. It can tell you shape and texture of what it is you're touching. Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it curved? Is it straight? So that stuff can be detected in the primary somatosensory cortex. In the secondary somatosensory cortex, we're getting a little bit more information and we're able to integrate both sides of the body. This is why if you play sports or if you watch it on TV, even though the 2 different hemispheres control our arms and legs, we can coordinate and run in stride, as well as put both of our arms above our head to catch a football, shoot a basketball, etc. So in the secondary somatosensory cortex, both sides of the body's touch system are being integrated together. It tells us if it's meaningful and sometimes if it's rewarding. I could close my eyes, and if I touch a basketball, I know it's a basketball, and I used to love playing basketball. So to me, it's rewarding. If you know what it is and you know what it's used for, without having to see it or hear it, you could just touch it and know, hey, this is something I really like. So meaning and reward come through this information in the secondary somatosensory cortex. as well as connecting to the hippocampus, which remember is our memory system. So it lets us know that we've used this before, that we like it, and it's our emotional system, right? So reward will go to the nucleus accumbens and things like that. And of course, it activates the rest of the limbic system, the emotional center. So it helps to coordinate touch and body senses along with vision and audition. So it puts together 3 of the 5 senses before they're sent to the prefrontal cortex. The only thing that it does not combine, of course, is taste and smell, which are already under the prefrontal cortex in the insular area. So it allows us to orient in space. It allows us to know where we are um, and where an object is or a sound is uh, compared to where we are. How far away is that object? How far away is that sound? Um, can we touch it? If we do, will we be able to recognize it? Yes. So this is specialized for things like your posture, staying upright, reaching for things, grasping for things. If something is touching you, being able to notice it, it puts all of that touch information together, and it allows us to know what it is a lot of times by the touch. If you know what a pencil looks like, maybe you can hear the sound of the pencil on the paper. Somebody hands you the pencil, you'll be able to grip it and know that you have a nice grip on it. And even if you didn't see or hear it, you could put your fingers over it and know, oh, this is a pencil. I feel the point here. I feel the eraser here. Right. This goes between my fingers so I can write. You can do that without your visual and auditory system. But of course, it puts everything together at once if you're using them all. If we have damage to this area, we've already talked about it. Neglect, if it's in the right side of the brain, which is most of the time where we see neglect, the left side of space is simply ignored. It's almost as if your brain doesn't even know it's there. You don't notice any difference, any deficit, but you just literally don't pay attention to that side of space. You could also read a little more about body integrity identity disorder, or what we call out of body experiences. It's like something's happening, but you're watching from outside, that it doesn't feel like it's even your body. So this is another sort of consequence if this stream or if this pathway, especially this part of the brain, is damaged. We're not going to get too much farther about this because I'm not concentrating too much on this chapter as opposed to the other two, but it is good to know what happens if there's damage, right? That's part of our whole course outcomes. So when we talk about specific nerve endings, they are stimulated by things like intense pressure, so it can start to hurt if somebody squeezes you too hard, especially if it breaks bones. Hopefully you're not in contact with any wrestlers or things like that that may happen. But free nerve endings are stimulated by things like intense pressure, by temperature extreme, either hot or cold, by damage to the tissues, or by certain chemicals, which causes pain. Chemicals could be fire, chemicals could be, right, certain gases and things that we've discussed earlier. And so, in response, your body wants to protect itself and your brain wants to protect your body. So, this is why we get inflammation. Inflammation is when the body or the brain, through the touch system, senses that something is wrong. And so it will release a wide array of molecules, which we call sort of this inflammatory soup. And what that does is the area that is in question, the area that's in pain, will form like this little internal bandage around it, by which we talk about swelling. It's fluids, of course, but it is there to protect it. So if you've ever sprained your ankle and then you notice that um, it hurts a little less after a few seconds, because our brain is, of course, releasing endorphins and natural painkillers, but it is also making a sort of protective barrier around the damaged part of your body. in this case, the ankle. So your ankle gets really big and swollen. That is the body's attempt to not let anything touch it directly and swell it up to protect it from further damage. Sometimes we have pain that is very quick, very sharp, very specific, and that goes through a myelinated axon called A delta. It's a much bigger, larger one. Remember, like we talked about in chapter 2, that the thicker the axon, the faster the speed. So pain that comes really quickly, a gunshot wound, hopefully that'll never happen, or something that really gets you really fast and you feel it right away, is a large fiber, a large axon called the A delta. Sometimes we have just kind of a small pain, which is kind of dull and achy. I know sometimes when I got into a car accident in about 14 years ago in 2006, and that left me with compressed vertebrae in C5 and C6. I should probably go back to those names of those dermatome areas. But sometimes I just get this sort of, I wake up and maybe I slept on it wrong because the vertebrae is still compressed in my system. And so some days if I sleep on it wrong, I'll wake up and I'll feel a little numbness or tingling in my fingers, and I will feel the sort of this dull, achy pain. It's not enough to deter me. Maybe I'll try to take something like an Advil, an anti-inflammatory, right? We call those NSAIDs, NSAID, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So Tylenol can be one, but not really. That's acetaminophen. Ibuprofen, Aleve, Advil, like that family. Naproxen sodium, which is Aleve. Those are all anti-inflammatories, or NSAIDs. So for the small, more dull pain, it's not very localized. Maybe it's in the whole area, not really in one specific spot. Those are C fibers for pain. Small, unmyelinated, transmit slower, kind of diffuse, dull, achy pain, kind of everywhere in that area, not in one specific spot. So if it is sharp, if it is quick, if it is localized to one little specific area, those are A delta fibers. If it's slower and just kind of a dull ache, kind of in one area but not a specific place, those are the smaller C fibers. So for the pain pathway, how does this work? Again, once that information about touch and tissue damage gets to the spinal cord, it crosses over. The spinal cord is going to release glutamate, and I told you that pain earlier in this course has its own chemical. It's called substance P. So glutamate and substance P goes up through the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, and that gives us information that there is some sort of damage. Although the pain system, kind of sucks because pain is not fun, pain is really necessary for us because it's our body's natural alarm system that tells us something is wrong. So not only do we get the actual pain feeling, but sometimes, most of the time, it's also an emotional problem, right? So not only does it go to the somatosensory cortex, but it also goes to areas that are part of the limbic system that process the emotional aspects of pain. And in fact, when we're feeling empathy, a lot of times, you can actually feel the pain of others, but it's not physical pain, so it won't go to the somatosensory cortex. I like to use the example, fellas, when we see another dude get kicked in a sensitive area and we're watching, when we're watching a movie or a TV show or something, and boom, down goes the guy because he got kicked in that sensitive area. You can almost feel it, and you can give that guttural ooh, even though you don't feel the physical pain. You can kind of empathize with what he's going through, and that would be the emotional aspect of pain, right? That's an empathy sort of function. Really quickly, I'm going to go back a couple slides. I apologize. And I wanted to go back here. So you can see that there are different letters and different sections attached to these. We have different sections of spinal cord that correspond to different areas or dermatomes. We have cervical, You can see C1 through C8, I believe it is. We have thoracic, which is the T. We have sacral, which is lower back and butt. We have lumbar, right? So there's a few different sections of spinal cord. The ones at the face, you see a 1, a 2, and a 3 in Roman numerals. Those are cranial nerves as opposed to spinal nerves. So we have very specific nerves that go to the face and head called cranial nerves, and the rest of it that goes to the body are called the spinal nerves. When I got into my car accident, as you can see where the guy is raising his left hand, my head and neck went to the left into a side airbag. So around right below where it's the number 3 cranial nerve is, my head went left and hit, and I didn't feel it right away. So I was an idiot, and I was in my 20s, and I just went and played basketball that night. And the next morning, oh mama, right? So I have compression in C5 and C6. So if you look here, you can see that C5 is along the bicep of the left hand or left arm, and C6 is along the top of the forearm that goes to the thumb and a little bit to the index finger. So on my left arm, I have partial numbness. It doesn't hurt. I have a lack of strength, and I'm left-handed, which kind of sucks. So I can't throw a baseball or a softball nearly as far as I used to because I just don't have the strength. And I have had partial numbness just in that top portion. So just along the bicep. Bicep itself doesn't hurt, but along the top of the forearm and the left thumb, I feel like partial tingling, and I don't have full sensation there. Some days it's worse than others, but it's nothing debilitating, which means I'm still able to do most of the things that I could, just don't have as much strength. And a lot of times, a lot of mornings, I'll wake up with, pain in that sort of general area. The thumb and the forearm, I don't have pain. I just have a lack of feeling, at least partial lack of feeling. And if there's more compression on some days than others, I'll feel more tingling and a little bit more numbness in that area. So there's your dermatomes. So that's how we know that specific areas of the somatosensory cortex or the motor cortex are associated with very specific parts of the body, and they are coordinated together. So if something grabs me on the forearm, as you can see, forearm there like T1, it's going to go and hit the T1 area of the somatosensory cortex, go right next door to the motor cortex, and I will be able to move T1 specifically to get somebody to stop from grabbing me. All right, going back, if it lets me. So, pain relief has to work by blocking some of these channels. We've already talked a little bit earlier in the course about how local anesthetics work by blocking sodium channels in the pain neurons. So they reduce action potentials and reduce activity. If substance P does not flow to the brain, remember it's a neurotransmitter. If you're basically blocking substance P from firing because the action potential won't fire, you're blocking the pain. That's a very local, very specific thing, right? We use local anesthetics for like Novocaine for in case we have to go, the dentist has to drill and give you a filling or a root canal or things like that. What they do is they inject Novocaine right into the gums and that area, and it blocks all the pain to where they're going to drill. So you can feel it a little bit, but it's numb. And you won't feel the pain because substance P specifically is being blocked. General anesthetics are the ones that sort of knock you out for surgery. It's usually a gas that you breathe, and what that does is it basically puts the CNS to sleep and doesn't allow it to wake up. So you don't feel the pain because everything is shut down and can't get back up. Drugs like aspirin or ibuprofen, one of these inflammatory signals that are being released when in response to a sprain or a being hurt are called prostaglandins. So these prostaglandins are being made by the body in response to injury, and that sort of gives that protective swelling over the injured body part. What ibuprofen and these things do, Aleve and sometimes aspirin, aspirin thins the blood out a little bit, but also they all inhibit these prostaglandins. So these NSAIDs, NSAID, non-steroidal, which means it's not a steroid, anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs. What they do is they inhibit prostaglandins, they inhibit that soup, or they reduce the amount of prostaglandins if they've already been set in motion. They suppress them. Tylenol works like that to a degree as well, but not as good as these specific anti-inflammatory drugs. With Tylenol, it's sort of one of the things. And of course, the other way that we block pain, if it's great pain, is by using opiates. So after surgery, we see things like morphine and those type of drugs at the extreme end, because once you wake up from surgery, right, and your body has been cut open and poked and prodded, there's a lot of pain involved in that once you wake up. So morphine is used a lot of times to really intensely control that pain. Similar drugs, Vicodin, Oxycontin, Vicodin sort of to a smaller degree, but Oxycontin, right? And of course, heroin, which was, if you use heroin, that's a street drug, which was actually synthesized from morphine to make it even stronger and to be able to be done in a lab so they didn't have to try and find or steal morphine. The problem with opiates, of course, is that tolerance is very rapid and it's very addictive because you get this great sort of high, right? This euphoric feeling, which is an intense happiness that comes with the pain relief. And so, it's, you can't really have one without the other. Intense pain relief and this euphoric, intense, happy feeling, and your body and your brain says, "Oh, we need this," right? So morphine is very dangerous in the hospital. Obviously, heroin on the street is very dangerous, and painkillers are very dangerous because people can become addicted to them quite quickly. The bigger the effect, so the bigger the dosage, like an Oxycontin, is much more likely to be abused and to develop an addiction to than Vicodin, but those things can happen all the time, especially if you watch the show House, because House was very addicted to Vicodin. He would eat them like Tic Tacs every episode. There are alternative medications. I'm not really going to go into them. The MDAN series, tanezumab, which is sort of an antibody for nerve growth factor, so the nerve doesn't grow so well. It's a little bit more sensitive or less sensitive to pain. We're not going to get into that, like I said. Endorphins, of course, are the natural painkillers in our body, and they respond to pain. So if I go back to that example of spraining an ankle, you will feel the pain at first once it hits the brain, and the pain pathway and substance P is released. Endorphins are considered a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system and a hormone because they go throughout the body as well. And they act at opiate receptors to block the pain. And when we take drugs like opiates, what opiates are doing is it's a natural agonist. So they're opening opiate receptors, or what they're doing is they're increasing endorphin production in your body. And so more endorphins will flow, as well as blocking pain receptors. So it kind of works on two levels. It increases the endorphins in your system naturally, and it blocks pain receptors. So you're getting this intense euphoric feeling. You can reverse this effect by using naloxone. Sometimes naloxone is used as a medication to try to get people off of opiate addiction, like heroin. So how does this work? Well, it's fairly simple. Pain causes the release of endorphins. We've seen this in animal studies during inescapable shocks, like little foot shocks that we give to, that we use for, rats and mice. Again, the shocks are not going to hurt them. No tissue damage. We're talking about something like, when you touch metal after you rub your feet on the carpet and you get that electrostatic shock. So again, for the purposes of animals and keeping them safe. This is not a hurting them type of thing. Physical stress can cause endorphins to be released. Acupuncture is effective because it causes endorphin release, and that's why people, even though you get needles stuck in you, you get the sense of relief if there's pain in certain areas. During childbirth, of course, there is endorphins that help make it, even though it is still painful. Again, I've never experienced it, but my wife has. That there are also, of course, painkillers to block more of the pain, but during childbirth and stimulation of that area causes endorphin release, and we can actually cause it in placebos. Make you think that there's pain relief, but maybe there isn't. Does that work as well? Depends on the person. I mean, it's never going to work as well as the actual stuff, but if you can trick the brain into thinking so, then you're in good shape there. If we look at placebo administration, you can see that the areas of the brain that light up in A are to actual pain, and in B, we see the placebo causing the same pattern of activity as an opiate, which blocks pain, right? So in A is actually taking the opiate drug and the opiate pathways in the brain, and you can see that the placebo allows for a similar effect. And you can even argue that there's more activity in red for that. The blue dot is what we call the cingulate cortex, which is in the frontal lobe, sort of just underneath, kind of near the basal ganglia and those areas. And that is where the emotional aspects of pain, that's part of that limbic system that causes the emotional aspects. So again, if you see a guy get kicked in the midsection and you feel the pain that that person is going through, you're like, ooh, and you have that physical gut response, that would be sort of a placebo response, and it would be an emotional response that doesn't actually cause pain. You don't see the somatosensory cortex light up, but you see the similar areas for the emotional aspects of pain. So don't dwell too much on this slide. It just shows you that we can get pain relief from a placebo administration because we can detect pain in an empathic way as well. Of course, non-endorphin, there are also non-endorphin pain relief methods. Hypnosis, acupuncture near the pain site. Why is it that other things can actually control the pain pathway? Well, Melzack and Wall came up with this idea called the gate control theory. And what they said is, in this theory, that pressure triggers an inhibitory message, which tells that neural pathway to close the gate and don't let all of the pain through. Because we know that pain is necessary, but too much pain is also going to be a problem for us. So the brain's natural reaction sometimes is to sort of gate some of that pain. And that also may be why in response to an injury, that at first you're going to get a rush of pain, and then we have the endorphins that are released and things like that. So we're going to get the endorphins that are going to take pain away a little bit, give us relief, and we're also going to sort of gate the pain pathway. So, okay, the brain got it, we got the signal, we don't need it to be necessarily as strong. Does it always work? No, but these things kind of work in succession with one another. So, the gate theory says, and I apologize, I see that there is a picture missing, so I will try to get that picture to you. But basically, the gate theory says that pain causes endorphin release from an area around of gray matter around the cerebral aqueduct called the periaqueductal gray. Now remember, in chapter 2, we talked about the ventricle system. And in the ventricle system, we had 2 lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle. In between the third and fourth ventricle is a little connector called the cerebral aqueduct. And so this area of gray cell bodies around that aqueduct is what we call the periaqueductal gray, or PAG. In that area, it serves as a gate and controls the release of substance P. Substance P is the pain neurotransmitter. So if that theory causes endorphin release, it inhibits substance P and sort of closes the pain gate that goes from that area to the spinal cord. So this circuit is activated by that cingulate cortex when there is a placebo effect, and in the amygdala during a fear response. So, well, let's see if we can do this. I'm going to, if you guys will bear with me real quick, go to your class section and show you guys while I do this. If we go down to where the online module 3 down below, my computer let me going down all the way. Chapter 11, pain and its disorders. I think that's where we are now. So bear with me for a second. Like I said, it's a shorter chapter anyway. Step we down. Here is the gate theory right here. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and you can see here is the picture that is missing from your output. But again, if you go to the lectures down below, I have them written out, and I'm giving them to you via recording. So you can see that here's the midbrain. There's that cerebral aqueduct and the periaqueductal gray around it. And so what it's doing is sending inhibitory messages and inhibiting, as you see down here, inhibiting substance P and things like that. So we are getting less pain in this area. And this actually can be, like I said, administered as a placebo because the cingulate cortex can sort of signal the same thing. So let's go back. And that's where we were. So sorry that the pictures are missing in some of these. If we go, so again, we talked about pain sucking. We talked about pain not being fun. Of course it's not, especially if it's chronic pain. It can lead to depression, people to have suicidal thoughts and things like that. It's not fun at all. But not having pain, although it sounds like a dream, is again our body's alarm system. So if you don't have pain, if you don't feel these things, then you won't know that something's actually wrong. When we get pain and substance P is released, it is released because it's our way of telling our brain, hey, something's wrong with our body. So if somebody has a really big insensitivity to these pain receptors, less sensitivity to them, they barely feel anything. Some people are born with a mutation that doesn't allow them to feel pain. And a lot of these people joined the freak show of the circus because they could do whatever they wanted and never get hurt or feel pain. So a disorder where the body doesn't feel pain is called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain. And it's defined as an inadequate motivation to avoid injury. So you could be walking down the street and all of a sudden you're kind of limping and you're like, oh, this is really weird. I'm walking kind of funny, but I have no idea why. You could have broken a bone and you would have never known. You could have gotten shot and, you know, had some sort of internal injury and you'd never know because you didn't feel the actual pain. So what are the causes of CIPA? Non-functional pain neurons. So there's a mutation in the what's called the SCN9A sodium channel. So your pain neurons basically don't function at all. Again, sounds pretty cool. It's not, because you could be seriously hurt and never know it. It could be due to reduced number of pain circuit neurons. So maybe there is pain, but you barely feel it. I know a lot of people that play sports may have this reduced number of circuit neurons or sensitivity. Or you could just have really high levels of endorphins and right away, you just never feel that much pain, right? Why is it that some people barely scrape their finger and they're crying in pain. And some people could break a bone and then they're just kind of like, yeah, go on about your day, right? So it could be due to individual differences of your levels of endorphins, reduced number of pain circuits, or you could actually have the mutation that doesn't allow people to feel pain, much, if any at all. Of course, we could have the opposite end, as I just talked about. For nociceptive pain, you could have hyperactive pain receptors, which means even the smallest little headache could be excruciating because your body is in overdrive. Oh my God, there's an alarm, there's something wrong. And it's like, dude, I just bumped my hip on the bed or whatever, right? So some people have really, really low tolerance to pain. And sometimes in society, we make fun of people like that, which is unfortunate because it's not about, again, we talk about nature and nurture, right? A lot of times it's based on hyperactive pain receptors. And if your body is telling you there's pain, even though you barely bumped it, you have to listen because that's your body's alarm system. Sometimes we have what we call neuropathic pain when there's been damage to the CNS or to the peripheral nervous system. A lot of times neuropathic pain is seen in the form of amputations because, as we talked about in, I think it was chapter 3, that sometimes in the motor cortex and things like that, if you lose a limb or you lose something, that the neurons can rearrange and take over more of that area. And although your brain knows for the most part that limb is gone, right? Again, if we went back to the dermatomes, you could see that T1 area of the forearm, right? If that arm got cut off, let's say you were a soldier, in a war and you lost a limb, or as is all too close to home for me, my father suffered from diabetes and actually had both legs amputated before he passed away. He had his left leg amputated like mid 90s and his right leg about 9 or 10 years later, right below the knee. So your nerves and your neurons in that area rearrange or move a little bit, and sometimes it makes it feel like they're still there. My father would complain a lot about pain in his legs when he had, like, Lieutenant Dan, you ain't got no legs. It's okay. It was a joke we shared. Don't worry, I'm not being insensitive to my father. Rest in peace. Yeah, he would feel pain there. And so that type of pain is called neuropathic. And it is not caused by physical pain, right? So, by the way, one of the things, as well, it should be coming up, I think, is to look at your leg in a mirror and just show the placebo administration, the cingulate cortex, and just to see physically that there's no limb there, and that sort of shuts off the neuropathic pain pathway. So sometimes in physical therapy, that they will put amputees in front of a mirror just to show their brain and show their visual system that there's nothing there, and it kind of shuts off that pain, or stops tricking it. So let's talk about chronic pain. There's a lot of people that have chronic pain from past injuries, or they may have a disorder like fibromyalgia, which causes the nerves in the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system to sort of just go off for no good reason. It just kind of sets them off. So chronic pain, especially in amputee patients, right, as we've been talking about, persists after healing has occurred. They still feel pain in the area where the limb was. If you have a reduced pain threshold, if you're a little more hyperactive in your pain receptors, then it can cause an increased susceptibility to pain, again, even if the limb is not there. And chronic pain can actually cause overstimulation of the neurons and can cause some of the gray matter to die because it's overstimulated. And so you see this gray matter loss. That's what the graph or the picture is showing in patients with chronic back pain or things like that, right? You're overstimulating it. On the right, you can see sort of that area that's in red is in the periaqueductal gray. It's right next to that cerebral aqueduct. And that you're getting a reduction in the gray matter of that periaqueductal gray. So that thing that amputees, as I just described, suffer from, about 80 to 90% of amputees actually suffer from this. It's called phantom pain. And in phantom pain, remember I said that in response to injury or things like that, because normally you don't get both cut off at the same time, right? So you have information from the left side of the body going to the right brain, information from the right side of the body going to the left brain, majority, right, 85 to 90%. So what's happening is neurons from other body areas are coming in and invading the area that normally receives input. So because your brain likes to work together, as we talked about, it's trying to give information from both sides of the body. Both hemispheres of the brain corresponding to both sides of the body. There's been movement on one area, and when the information is shared back and forth, there is a discrepancy. There is a problem. So that causes pain. That causes the alarm system to go off. So neurons from other body areas invade the area that normally receives input from the missing limb. So the reason you're still feeling something is because you're getting information, you're getting a signal from whatever took over that area. So one of the things that you can do is to wear a prosthetic limb, which not only is maybe more aesthetically pleasing for some people because it makes you look whole, you can, but it also tells the brain, hey, something's there, don't worry about the signal, even though it's not your own flesh, right? It's fake. But, and then the other thing is called a mirror box, which again uses mirrors to trick your brain into thinking that the limb is there. So I think in the next chapter, in chapter 12 in Learning and Memory, we're going to talk a little bit about mirror neurons in the frontal lobe that help us to learn by observing others and doing what they do. We see this in monkeys, we see this in humans. And whenever you go to YouTube and learn how to try to fix something, right? It's using your mirror neurons. You're imitating what the person or people or whatever is doing in order for you to learn how to do it. Well, tricking those mirror neurons into thinking the limb is still there is a way to trick your pain perception, right? So again, the picture missing. So if you allow me to go back here, let's go down to where we were. Oh, I guess, I guess that's not here. So maybe we can go back really quickly. And we're going to worry about that. But basically, it's just saying that it's just saying that the whoa, here we go. That we can trick our brain into remembering that there's nothing there, therefore the pain will stop. And then really quickly, come on. I guess we can stop here. But the muscles that innervate the body, we didn't go specific into them. The chapter goes deeper into what the muscles are and the parts of the muscles and things like that. What I will leave you with in this portion of the lecture is that we have skeletal muscles, which are called striated, which correspond to those strips of dermatomes. Those are the ones that move the body in its limbs, right? So those sections of muscles in the sacral, the lumbar, the thoracic, the cervical areas of the body, right? Those that are controlled by the dermatomes or live in the area of the dermatomes are the skeletal muscles. Those move the body, they move the limbs, right? The things we've talked about. We also have smooth muscles, which are actually coordinated by the basal ganglia, smooth muscle movements. And those are the internal organs. So if you feel your stomach growling, when the heart's beating and causing the heart to beat and causing these things to happen, those are the smooth muscles. And of course, actually the heart itself is its own system called the cardiac. So contractions of the heart, meaning causing it to beat and pump blood, are very specific. So smooth muscles would be the other internal organs. If there's any other damage or movement or function for the heart, but the actual contractions of the heart and pumping the blood are the cardiac muscles specifically. So when we I guess we should probably just do this, and then I'll make a shorter lecture for the other movement disorders. So before we sign off, we like using these tables. It's very useful, provides a lot of specific information. The prefrontal cortex, of course, is the one that selects the appropriate behavior and uses a combination of internal and external information. So in the touch system, we talked about, right, if something is wrong, like you sprain an ankle, that information from the ankle is going to go up through the spinal cord, cross over. If it's your left ankle, most of that information going to the right side of the spinal cord, up through the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. In the frontal lobe, so we talked about the parietal lobe. In the frontal lobe, that detect movement and send information about movement, we have the primary motor cortex, which is down here, that executes voluntary movement. So again, in response to spraining an ankle, maybe, you feel it as it goes up in your somatosensory cortex. So that pathway, ankle, spinal cord, crosses over, goes up, thalamus, somatosensory cortex. When we need to do something about it, like limp or hop on one foot because our foot is injured, we feel the pain based on the somatosensory cortex. Well, what do we do now? Well, okay, either limping on it and not putting pressure on it, or even hopping on one foot so we don't put any pressure on it. That information goes to the primary motor cortex, which is going to execute voluntary movements by organizing the activity, which adds force and direction of control. We have the premotor cortex, which combines information for movement programming. So what the premotor cortex is doing is, let's say that you're thinking about a movement, right? So let's say, let's change gears for a second here. And instead of injury, let's talk about wanting to do something. So you're at the free throw line playing basketball and you want to shoot a free throw. It's about 15 feet away and you are thinking about how you're going to put arc on the ball or how hard you're going to throw it. The premotor cortex is combining information that's needed for movement programming. So just planning out your movement, thinking about the arc and the direction and how much spin you're going to put on the ball and things like that. So such as the target being reaching for and its location, which arm to use, the arm's location. If I'm handing you a pen and you need to know how far away and how much grip you need to grab the pen, if you feel me still holding the pen after you grab it instead of letting go, right? These types of things. That's the premotor cortex that's involved in knowing what to do. Primary motor cortex, again, executes the movement. And then there's a supplementary motor area, which assembles sequences of movement. So that allows us to know eating, playing the piano, coordinating the movements between the two sides of the body. So just kind of like the secondary somatosensory cortex is combining the movement from, or touch system, sorry, from both sides of the body. Supplementary motor area is coordinating the movements between both sides of the body as well. Because you need both hands mostly to shoot a free throw. One, I'm left-handed, so my left hand is the main one that's going to throw the ball up, but the right hand is going to guide it to go hopefully as straight as possible. So task sharing between the hands is going to be the supplementary motor area. We talked about the basal ganglia in chapter 3. The basal ganglia is a secondary area of motor, and also uses information from the somatosensory cortex to integrate and give us smooth movements. Apparently, it's involved in learning the sequences. So being able to hold the ball the way you do, put it up, and shoot the free throw. And yes, I'm pantomiming it as I do it because I so miss my basketball. And of course, the cerebellum is maintaining the fine motor movements, refining the movements, making sure that I have control of my fingers and my hands when I'm shooting the free throw, and that I do it with the appropriate amount of force. It controls eye movements, and is involved in learning motor skills. So just learning the sequence of shooting a free throw involves the cerebellum as well. So we will get back to this. I will go over this again in the next lecture. But until then, um, we'll talk about movement and the major movement disorders like Parkinson's disease when we come back next time. So I will talk to you guys very soon. I hope you enjoyed this lecture.